So welcome to the final chapter. In here, we're going to create a render scene for rendering the occlusion shader for all of your meshes with the intent to display them for critique. And this could be critique in my classroom, your classroom, or even critiques on online forums. I think that it's really in your best interest as a beginner modeler or as an intermediate or even advanced modeler that you regularly practice presentation skills for the models that you've created, and this will give you the best feedback that you could possibly receive for the work that you've created. So we're going to do an occlusion shader rendering, and we're going to do wireframe renderings, and we're going to do possibly a rendering with maybe a final gathering if I see that there's time or if it's fit to do so. So to get this process started, we're going to import meshes that we have already exported. So I've taken the time to export a mesh already. So I'm going to go to my File Import menu, and I've made a folder here special for the exports. So I've got the cup file exported, and I'm going to choose to import that. And the way I did this is I went to the original cup scene, and I selected it, and then I went to the File Export Selection tool and option box, and in here I define the file type, and I also define whether or not I'm going to include any history, such as modeling history, channels, expressions, constraints, things like that. It's going to be your decision of whether or not you keep that. I recommend that you don't, in order to keep your rendering as fast as possible. And then, because you're making changes and you're deleting histories, I think it's best that you also save an additional version of each file that you've modeled as the final version, so that you don't overwrite all your hard work in case you do want to go back and make changes through history, such as surfaces and curve history. I'm going to save this scene as my final render turntable scene, and this scene we're going to set up a very basic rendering, maybe some 3-point lighting, and I'll show you all the things you need to know on how to render this out on a single station. So no network rendering, I'm afraid, but definitely the rendering that you need to know on a single workstation. So we've already done with this with the cat we saw earlier. We're going to go through, do it on some of the earlier objects like the ribbed cup. I want to do that one. And I'm just going to select this mesh, and I'm going to go to File Export Selection option box. I don't even have to delete the history or change anything really, because I'm not going to include the history on this object. So all this modeling history right here, it's going to get wiped out for me automatically. And I'm going to choose to export this selection, and I'm going to go into my exports folder, and I'm going to use all caps to name this, and I'm going to be cupped ribbed, all capitals, just so it's easier for me to identify that this is my final export. And I'm going to continue doing this throughout all the other scenes, exporting each one with the intent to import into the final scene. So I'm going to take the time off capture to export each one individually, and then I'll be back when I'm done with that to import each one. So I'm polishing the Monopoly house to export and bring into the final scene, and there's a couple of details that I did to this that I think are important. I don't intend to use subdivision surfaces with this. So what I did is I beveled all of the outside edges, and I used a relatively small bevel, 0.1 to 0.2, and I did that with the chimney as well, at the top and the bottom of the chimney. And I also did that around all of the outer edges of the body. So if I hide the roof here, I've got all the outer edges of the body taken care of. A couple of things happened at the corner that I thought were worth noting, that there was a fold that had occurred in the corners here. And so what I did is I removed the face that was folded. So let me get rid of this point right here. And so the reason that's so important is that I actually had to write a little script to make it happen. And it's so super easy. I went into the script editor and I typed out split polygon tool, semicolon, and then I highlighted that, middle click, dragged and dropped it to the shelf. So I just put it on the polygon shelf, and it has its own little default icon. I right-clicked that to edit it, and I went over to the shelf tab, and I just went to this Maya tab to pick the icon. And I just went through this list and I found an icon that I liked. I just searched for icons for split, and I got a couple icons here, so I grabbed that icon, and then I hit the Save All Shelves button. And so now every time I want to use the Split Polygon tool, I just tap that, and it's a super easy tool to use. It's the original one. It's the best one. It's way better than the interactive split. And so you just click and drag wherever you want to leave the point. And this is a great way to just add a point to an edge, too, if you needed to do that. And then you just click and drag onto the next edge that you want to jump to, and then you hit Enter when you're done. And then I can use Merge Vertex tool to grab the, put these together. So I didn't mind there being an N-gon over here on the side. I just wanted to make sure that corner was nice and smooth when I use the when I'm not using subdivision surfaces. I wanted that to appear as clean as possible. And another thing too about the Split Polygon tool is that it has its tool settings. So if you open up tool settings when you use that, when you run it, you have a couple options in here that you can edit. I'm not entirely sure why Autodesk decided to remove this from the polygon menu. It used to sit right here, right where the interactive split is. I wish they would just put it back there so that we had the option. And apparently we still do have the option because you can run it as a mel command. So anyway, you can actually run it once just by typing it in the mel command down here. You could just type in Split Polygon tool semicolon and then hit Enter, and it'll run one time. But more than likely you'll want to use it many times. So I just made a little tool for it. A little icon on the shelf for it. So the last thing that I did for these two pieces is I ran this tool called Set Normal Angle on both of these, and I set the normal angle to be 89 degrees, and I hit Apply. And that helps them appear smooth in the viewport without having to use subdivision surfaces. And I would recommend this kind of strategy for architectural type pieces where you wanted to show off edges where you could bevel the edges, but then you don't want to use subdivision surfaces to save on RAM, to save on speed. So there it is. Okay, now I'm ready to import. I've finished all of my exports. And when I go to the import option box or the import panel on the side here, be sure to check to group and to ignore versions. And if you had conflicting shading networks, you can use the remove duplicate shading networks. Everything else seems to be good. From here, I'm going to go to my exports folder and one by one start bringing in my objects. And when you import it, if the object had a layer associated to it, that layer, that display layer, is available as well. And you may just need to take a moment and name that top level group that's been added. And it's really handy to have that import feature create that automatic group for you. You just have to name it. Okay, I've imported every piece and I've named every group. My next step is to make sure that all of my items are sitting on the ground. And as I modeled them, I tried to make sure that everything I did was somehow level on the ground. But I think one or two of these, like this cup, is actually lower, and I think the pipe might be as well. So I'm going to take a moment to get that level on the ground. To do it, I'm going to, let's get the wood dowel out of the way. Just hide the wood dowel. To do this, I'm going to center the item again, back to the origin, center that, there we go. And with the mesh selected underneath, I'm going to group it and translate that group up. And I'll even snap, by hitting the insert key, I'll snap the group to the lowest point on the cup and then snap that to the ground plane. So now I know I'm level on the ground plane. And we can tuck that to the side. And I'll do the same thing for the pipe. Same thing for the pipe. And I'm going to center the group, make sure it's grouped, and make sure the mesh is centered. Select the mesh. And I will, and this time I think I'll just hit insert and flop to the front view and move it straight down until it's just about level with the bottom, and then hit insert again, and then I'll snap that holding X, snap that to the origin, and that's as good on the ground as it can get right now. So from here, I've got a couple things I need to do for rendering. I want to make decisions on how I'm going to lay out these objects. I want to have a decent presentation, particularly for my class. I want to spend some time on repetition of items and making an interesting scene. It's not just a turnaround of single objects that we're going to do. We're going to put all of these things into the same scene. Some of them will turn around, and in general just trying to make an interesting image with these objects. For those of you who are studying in my class, you will also have your toy, and your toy is the centerpiece. It's going to most likely be the most complex piece out of all the ones that you've done in class. Next thing I'm going to do is bring in a ground plane, make it massive, like 250 wide, and then I'm going to bring in a sphere to cap around that. And the reason for this is so that I can make globe or a contained environment to render occlusion, and I will set this to about 250 in radius, and which is, I guess, what, 500 in diameter. So let's make the ground plane 500. The ball should be pointing inwards, so we're going to reverse normals. We're also going to create a new camera to render with. So we're going to go to create cameras, and we'll make a standard camera. And this camera, we'll look through it. We'll go to the panels perspective and look through this new camera. And then this is the camera that we're going to use to actually render with. So I'll flip to the other camera, like in a 4-view situation. I can look at the other camera, the perspective one, and this one I can use to set things up with, whereas the camera 1, that's going to be the one that we're going to render with. So for the renderable camera, we're also going to set up in the view menu for the camera. Under camera settings, we're going to choose resolution gate so that we can see what's actually inside the frame. And we're going to choose the render settings options here. We're going to choose the mental ray is a render engine, and we're going to scroll down all the way to the bottom underneath the render options, scroll down even more, turn off enable default light, and then scroll back up and turn the preset to HD 720. So this is, again, if you're in my class, this is what I want, HD 720. And I think even professionals out there, you're looking to get some jobs, you should be rendering at least at this resolution to make an attractive rendering. We want to render a sequence. Ultimately, we're going to render a turntable. So I want to render out to anything like the Maya if file's okay, JPEG's okay, but I think depending on the engine that you're, or the program that you're using, you're going to have to be very picky about this. I'm going to go to, I think I'm going to use TIFF uncompressed. Now I'm going to use Targa. And here's the frame where you actually define how many frames get rendered, so it's automatically set to single frame. So you want to set it to name plus a number dot extension. Frame padding is your ability to skip frames, so we could render every other frame or every third frame. So padding of 1 means every frame is going to be rendered. And you can use a custom name for the file. And taking a look a little bit higher here under the path, right here where it says path, this is where my image is going to be saved. It's to this images folder, and it would be titled the same title of of my scene. So if I want a different name, I need that file name to be right here. So if we call this just simply turntable, notice that this file name up here at the top changes to turntable_1 to turntable_10, and that's the range. And down here is frame range, and we can change that to be the full frame range that we want. I want at least 120 frames, so 5-second turnaround. I think 240 looks nicer, actually. I think I might do 240. A little bit slower. And right here is the renderable camera, where you can change between the perps, which is the default 3D camera, and camera 1, the one that I made. In fact, I think what I'll do is go to this view, select camera, and rename this camera in the channel box here. We'll call it shot 1, and I might actually want to have more than one shot. And you can see that that's listed here as shot 1. What else do you need to know about this area? Right, if you use I think it's a / in front of turntable, you can actually define a folder. So we could say final. Yeah. So it'll create a folder called final. Within the folder, images, and I highly recommend that, because every time you render in this project directory, it's going to get dumped into the images folder, and you should use this subfolder technique to help organize it in there. Otherwise, you're just going to have a huge list of files. So I would use that. There's a setup that I like to use when I'm getting ready for rendering and just getting everything set up. I'm going to go to the ForeView and make sure that I'm looking through my shot camera, and I'm going to make sure I look through the second camera for editing, and I'm going to set this top panel here to be the outliner, so I have access to all my objects. And I'd also like this panel to be my script editor for anything that I might need to run while I'm working. And to make it a little bit easier to see through the globe, because you'll constantly be zooming in and out and through that, you can go to the attribute editor for the globe under Mesh Component Display, and under Backface Culling you can set it to hard, and what it'll do is, just because it's inside out, it's only showing you the front side of the polygon, so as you turn it around, you're able to look through and examine your scene from a distance. Also, place the globe and the ground onto a separate layer, and name that layer background. That should be fine. Layer. And make sure it's referenced so that you can't accidentally select it as you're working. So when I'm framing this, I'm going to be very delicate about how I move my camera. I'm going to center it to the origin by zeroing out its translation and rotation. And then I'm going to use the virtual sliders and selecting the value, the attribute that I want to affect. I'm going to move it in and out away from the objects. So what I'm going to do is actually push this to about 80 or so, maybe 100 away from it, and then I'm going to move it up. And the reason for this is that it makes for a better horizon line. Notice that in the back, the horizon line is more easy to control. So this space, so I have a better sense of where things are in space, as opposed to just sort of free-forming and moving your camera crazy all over the place. That's not very good camera work. I don't want to do that. So just hit Alt-Z to undo that stuff. So I'm going to zero this out, maybe push it back on the Z-axis 100 units, maybe up on the Y-axis 25 units, or maybe 15 units. And then, of course, then there's like pointing and like looking at the ground, so up and down. And we can see what the camera's doing over here. And we can either set up an aim constraint for it to point and look at things, or again, we can, as if we had it on our shoulder, we can just sort of tip it up, tip it down, walk it forward, walk it back. So I'm going to use the rotation on X to look up and look down, use the rotation on Y to look left, look right, and the Z if I want to bank it and maybe make it a bit more dynamic. But in general, I don't want it to be this crazy dynamic diagonals, because it's actually quite confusing. I'm actually trying to show off my models here so that people can critique them. I'm not trying to make some fantastically dynamic scene. Okay, so that's my tip on managing the camera. This heads-up display you're seeing about units, that's right here under display heads-up, and that's poly count. I can turn that off for now. And I think that the next thing to do is, now that I have a sense of where my camera is going to be and where the horizon line is, go through and decide what the scale of the different objects are going to be. So some of them are really, really big, some of them are really small, and I can compose a reasonably interesting image simply by playing with scale. And then I want to play with repetition, so how many of each of these objects am I going to have in the scene, and a lot of that's going to be governed by the processing power of your computer. So you're going to have to make that decision as you go, and when I'm ready to start test rendering, I'll show you sort of a test rendering, testing the times of the speeds, and we'll get to that soon enough. So while I'm framing up objects and I'm making decisions on where they are, I'm looking at the view that I'm editing in, so that would be the perps camera view, and I'm watching the frame. So I'm not adjusting the frame, I'm not even adjusting any of the objects within that camera's frame. I'm making all of my adjustments here. So if I want this cat to be closer, I'm just going to drag it closer until, you know, we're right on top of it. And I'm going to do some rotations and such right here, and I'm using the top level group to do that. Something else to take notice when I move the cat closer, its face starts to bow, starts to tear up a little bit. It's a good idea for your renderable camera to have a focal length of anywhere between 55 to 75. I recommend 55 because it's more natural of what our eyes actually see. And it is a slight zoom in. It has the effect of a slight zoom in, but it does tend to flatten things, and this is particularly nice if you wanted to do portraiture shots. In fact, you'd want to use anywhere between 75 and 150 if you're doing like human portraiture shots, so that the nose doesn't stretch out too badly. But since I'm looking for more of a natural look to this, what I'm going to do is use the 55, and so it's not quite as distorted when I move these objects closer to the camera. So like I said, and then of course the camera, which select that camera again, needs to be pushed back a bit more, so let's drop it back to about 150, maybe 130. And now what I'm doing is going through making decisions. I'm control clicking on the y-axis for this teapot, and I'm moving it around. And you know, if I want the manipulator for this teapot to be at the base of the teapot, and I probably do if I want the teapot to be sitting on top of something else, it makes it easier to lay this teapot onto something else. So what I'm going to do is center it to the origin again, and then I'm going to, with this teapot group selected, I'm going to group it again. And notice that the new group is right at the origin, so it's at the base of the teapot. And that worked out really well because I modeled my teapot above the Y0 ground plane. So I'm just going to call this teapot 2 group, so I don't have any naming conflicts. And now when I slide it around, oop, got one too many. Now when I slide it around, it will match that ground. So you know, if I want to snap this teapot to the top of the cup, it's just a simple matter of holding down V and snapping it to one of those points up there. So now it's super easy. So if I want like duplicates of this teapot to be on every step of that stairwell over there, it's going to be pretty easy to just snap and lay them into place. So keep track of those pivot points, keep track of those groups, because they're incredibly useful for laying out your scene. I'm going to model a turntable at the center, and the things that I want to be spinning around will be on top of this thing, and then on the sides and in the back I'll have static objects, duplicates of them sort of turned at different angles. It's my recommendation that you take the time to make a turntable that's unique to your work and does not overshout your work, but also doesn't drag it down, meaning it's not better than all your models, but it's certainly not overly simple and an eyesore. So you want something that's equally matches and carries your work slightly less good so that it doesn't take attention away from your models. You don't want your pedestal to be better than the sculpture, if you get my meaning. There's something I need to show you for the objects that are not using subdivision surfaces. My house and my stairwell, both, yeah, those two pieces, they're not using subdivision surfaces. And there's this quality, this visual in the real-time viewport that here you can see these facets here. I'm sure you can see them in the recording, in the capture. the house had it too, and so what I did is I selected the house and I went to normal, select normal angle, and I did this in their original files, but for some reason it didn't carry over, and set the angle to 89 and hit apply, and it smooths it out pretty good. And do the same thing for the stairwell. Just grab all the pieces of the stairwell and run the same thing on it. Set normal angle 89 and hit apply, and that faceting that you saw earlier should kind of butter over, so it's not so intense. There it is. I think that's traditionally called a smoothing shader, but it's all built in real time now. You can see that my turntable is using the same material as my stairwell, so I just dragged and dropped the from the Hypershade. Go here to the Hypershade, and here's a list of all the materials that I've made so far. So I grabbed the stairwell blend metal material, and I dragged and dropped it to that turntable, and then I selected the turntable, or I'm sorry, I selected the material in the Hypershade and open up the attribute editor so that I could edit it a little bit. And I noticed that reflectivity was on in one of the test renders I did. So I just toned it way, way down. A little bit of reflectivity can look nice. So I'm going to tone it way down. Okay, so I accidentally bumped my camera, and I found it very annoying that I had to figure out what my frame was again. And the Alt-Z didn't do it. It wouldn't take me back to where I was. So to prevent that from happening again, what I'm going to do is keyframe its transformations and its focal length at frame 1. So I'm going to highlight all of these, and I'm going to choose key selected, and everything turns red. And I'm going to choose the focal length and choose key selected. And so now at frame 1, those have been keyed. So if for any reason I move the camera out of the way, all you have to do is wiggle the timeline, and the camera will just snap right back to where it was, because that keyframe is a record of where it is at frame 1. And don't forget to adjust the frame range of the time slider down here at the bottom of the interface where it says 48. Set that to the max frames of what you want it to be, and also the other number sitting next to it, that's the timeline number. Set that to 240, so you can, your time slider is set to now to 240, and your range slider is a way to look at like chunks, so you could set the range slider to maybe 10 frames at a time, or 24 frames at a time, so 1 second at a time, and you could scroll through that. But we're not doing superior animation here, we're not doing anything really complex, we're just turning a table. And then to animate the turntable, I'm going to select it, and I'm going to keyframe its rotation. I'm going to keyframe everything just by hitting the S key, and notice in the channel box all of its parameters have been keyed. And then I'm going to go to frame 240, just scrub all the way to the other end, and I'm going to enter a value of 360 for the rotation on Y, and then I'm going to right click on that and choose key selected. So now that turntable, it will spin, and you can watch it spin in the active viewport. So just click in this gray bar right here to make it the active viewport, and you can watch it animate in real time in that viewport by scrubbing the time slider or by hitting play. And you can hit the comma and period key to jump from keyframe to keyframe if you want to jump from beginning to end. So go all the way to frame 1 and leave your playhead there. The playhead has this little gray tick mark with the number on it. That's your playhead. Just leave it at frame 1, and so as you want to attach things to the turntable, like let's put the wood dowel on the turntable. Here it is, and middle click, drag and drop it to the turntable. Actually, yeah, let's do that. And let's also group the turntable so that I can apply materials to it if I need to. And let's just capitals that, something like that. So the and the animation could have been applied to the turntable group, by the way. It didn't have to be on the object itself, so it doesn't really matter. So the dowel group is assigned to it, and so as it spins around, it's going to be spinning relative to the position of the turntable. So move the dowel group to translation XYZ 0, and it'll snap right to the center of its parent. And this is a good, right now, here's a good example. I just saw something where it's a good idea to move the a pivot point to where you want these objects to be snapping, and we could actually put like a little null or a group or a locator right at the surface of the turntable, so that we don't have to constantly correct objects to because of this clipping right here. I can't get the words out. I don't want it to clip. So I'm going to move the dowel group out, and I'm going to create a locator, and I'm going to make the locator a child of the turntable, and then I'm going to snap the locator. Instead of fussing with pivots, let's just use a locator. And I'm going to snap the locator to that center point in the turntable. Yep, like that. So now, and so it's a value of 1. So now when I move the dowel group on top of locator, so we'll name this the top of table, something like that. So now when I put objects under that object, all I have to do is enter zeros for the translations, and it will be sitting right on top of it. So that's perfect. And the rotation of the wood dowel, I have some rotation there, so I'm just going to enter 0. And so by default it was pointing the other way. So I could enter 180 and have it facing me. And now when I scrub the timeline, it'll be turning. And then we can activate the render camera. Another thing to note is that keyframing, when you just hit the S key to keyframe like I did to make the turntable, the default curve in an animation F-curve has ease in and ease out. And let me show you what I mean. When I play it back, notice that it slowly starts turning, and then it gets to its normal speed, and then it slows down as it gets towards the end. So as it's looping and playing back, it doesn't have a very consistent turn. So what I like to do for presentation turntables is go to the animation editor, graph editor, and I'll select my turntable and hit A to fit it into the viewport. And so this is that slow out, slow in curve. So what I want to do is set it to be linear, this one right here, linear tangents, that one, and then do it for both of them. There we go. So now it's a straight line, and so it will consistently and evenly rotate from beginning to end. So when we loop it, and when you make a little movie and you want to loop it back for people, it'll have a nice constant rate while it's playing. And notice that my computer is trying to play this as fast as it possibly can, so that's not real-time playback right now. So you can go to this little jumping man icon way over here at the bottom right, click on that, and now you have the time slider options, and in here, instead of playback every frame as fast as it can, force real-time 24 frames per second. So I'll save that. So the next time I play it, okay, that's the actual rate right there. That's how fast it's going to turn. And my computer's actually not too bad. I can actually study the frame rate. We can show the frame rate under display heads up and give me the frame rate right here. And you can see right there it lists the frame rate, and let's play it back. So it's keeping 24 frames per second pretty good. It jumps up and down a little bit, but that's pretty darn good. Especially considering that there's over 50,000 polygons in my scene. Let me check that. So I can go to display, heads up display, poly count. Yeah, 41,000 I guess. Almost 42. That's reasonable. And my video card can play that back in real time, so that's sweet. I want to adjust the camera a little bit. I want to make sure the turntable isn't quite centered. I also want to see my safe areas, safe action. I want to see that. It helps me with the frame padding, so I can use that as a place to mark off where the turntable should be, and then be sure to key that at frame 1 to lock that camera in place. And I'm thinking about having the stairwell more towards the front, So I'm adjusting it. And I was thinking about going off frame with it. And then the cat, I think I would really like the cat to be on the turntable. And I'll center that up. And have the cat off to the side a bit, maybe rotate the group itself. And make sure I'm not crashing into the stairwell when it rotates. That's pretty good. Let's see, I think the teapot would be nice. I really like how the teapot came out. I like that one to be on the turntable. So middle click, drag and drop that. Enter zeros. And get it situated. I think that in this case, scale, I'm not really that concerned with actual scale. So as it's rotating, I'm curious, what kind of profiles am I going to be getting? What kind of contours am I going to get? Like I want to see, I would like to see the teapot on its side, on its profile as it turns. So no weird angles. The cat might be interesting if it were just bigger. That could be neat. Let's grab that and scale from the bottom. And it looks like I have a little bit of clipping going on there. And it doesn't look like it'll hit the stairwell. Don't want those to collide. So I think those three on the turntable are really nice. Let me just adjust its place a little bit. So those three main pieces on the turntable will be great. And I'm thinking about doing something special with the grape, so I want to talk about that, do a little bit of deforming on it. Let's get this cup out of the way. Get both of these cups out of the way. They're not that, they're not that interesting. They're really part of our early exercises. Now, I'm taking care of my middle ground space pretty good. Let's get that pipe out of the way for a moment. So I've got the middle ground space handled pretty good. Now I want to deal with the extreme foreground, like what's right up against the camera. Like the stairwell, for example, I could bring that in closer. I don't think I want to though. I think I like that. I like seeing it. I like seeing it connect to the floor, and I like how it clips a little bit here. I think maybe I'll make duplicates of either the cat or the doll or the house. I want something deep in the back, deep and complex in the back, and maybe use some of these cylindrical objects as some kind of structure. So I want to pivot this mug so that it's lying on its lip and its base. So I've got this idea of bringing in a couple of locators. So I've got two locators in my scene here, and my mug has been scaled down. That's not a big deal, but what's important is it hasn't been rotated yet, and I think that that's important because I want to snap these locators to the points where I want to pivot it. So like I want to pivot on the outside edge, and I want to pivot on the outside of the lip, and I'm just going to make one a child of the other, so so I can swing it. Actually, I think the other way around would be better. So that's the parent. So let's make locator 1. So the one at the bottom is the parent. So I can pivot that way. And then you take those two, let's put those on top of the turntable. And they stay right where they are in relation to the turntable. And then let's take the mug and make that a child of locator 1. So now I can pivot the mug down, see? So I'm pivoting right on that point. That way I don't have to fuss with um, changing centers and pivots and all that other stuff. So I'm just going to turn this until, you know, I'm right on top of that handle. I'm sorry, until it makes contact, you know, something like that. So that crosshair hits. And then, you know, if I wanted to later, you know, I could do that. You know, I could pivot up on it like that. So this would be like the beginning of what you might do to make a walking, rolling, tipping over mug. And let's grab that and just translate it back in world space. So something like that, it seems appropriate. And then let's see what that looks like in our camera. So it's decent. And, you know, I've been spending some time, you know, like leveling things out and making sure they're on the ground, like I just did with the mug here. And I also adjusted the cat so that its feet, I did it again. Okay. So that the cat's feet are, you see how cool that was? I just had to drag the time slider and it snapped the camera right back to where it needs to be. So I had to move the cat up and correct some intersection of the feet. And a really good way to regularly sort of check up on your contacts is really with shadows, because this is what it's all about really, is when we get to the end of things, is how are those shadows meeting up. And the occlusion shader can help take care of a lot of clipping polygons, which is why we use the occlusion shader really, to help butter things over. It just tends to make things look nice. But we could start this off with a shadow, and we haven't done anything with lights, and I think that would be a good place to go next. Alright, so let's bring a light into the scene, and this is going to change everything for me, because I'll be able to see where my shadows are going to lie. So we're going to go to, this is when we're not rendering the occlusion map, we're going to be rendering with shadows. Two different renders. So the spotlight is what you want to begin with, and if you hit T on your keyboard, you get the transform manipulators for the light, and there's two parts to it. One of them is the light itself, and the other one is where the light looks. So to see a preview of where the light is looking, we'd activate this viewport and then hit number 7 on the keyboard to see the effect of that light. So without this light, if you recall way back here at the render settings, way down at the bottom, we turned off the default light. So if we were to try and take a picture of this, we would see nothing. We would see black. So we have to add a light to see something. So I'm going to snap that light focus point right to the center of the turntable. And then I'm going to move the light up. Now, I don't see any shadows in real time for two reasons. One, I didn't turn them on, and two, I have to use a very specific setup to see them. So here's how you do it. With the light selected, go to the attribute editor, and under the spotlight shape tab, you have a couple of settings in here, and the ones that I want to pay attention to are the cone angle and the penumbra angle. So to see the effect of the cone angle and penumbra angle, go to your viewport renderer settings, and if your video card supports this, you can use viewport 2.0. If not, you may have to just use the high quality rendering. Viewport 2.0 supports real-time shadows, and one of the effects that it supports is the penumbra angle. So we can decrease this all the way down, and notice how it's tapering in the light. So it's softening that edge, and as we increase it, we can sharpen it, and then we can go the opposite direction and taper outward. Generally, I like to taper inward so that I know where the maximum width of my light is. So anywhere between like -3 and -5, something like that. And then the cone angle is just how far open is this light, so like the shutters or the blinders on the light. So we'll leave that at about 70 or 80, something like that. And then lastly, we just scroll down a little bit. Right here under Shadows tab and Depth Map Shadows is the Use Depth Map Shadows option. And that's what's going to allow me to see the shadows in real time with Viewport 2.0. You can see shadows in real time with high quality rendering and with depth map shadows, but you can also view them when you use the ray trace shadows. So, but unfortunately, Viewport 2.0 doesn't support the ray trace shadows option, at least not to my knowledge. So I'm going to use the viewport 2.0 because it's quite accurate and fast for my video card, and I'm going to use the depth map shadows. I'm going to increase the resolution quite high for my video card to 4096, and that makes for a reasonably accurate shadow for me to preview. So what I intend to do in my rendering on my computer is I'm going to view this so that I can see where my shadows are in the scene, where they lie in the scene, so that I can make better compositional decisions of where my objects are, where the shadows are, and their relationship. But when I actually go to render this, I'm going to use the Ray Trace Shadows option. I could use the depth map shadows. I would have to do a bit more research because it's been a while since I've used them. This is what it's going to look like in a render, and it should come up pretty quick in about 3 or 4 seconds. So it's pretty grainy right now. I would have to do some major break open the books, break open the manuals, and figure out what it is that I need to do to make that depth map shadow work for me. But I know that the ray trace shadow is going to look fantastic in the render, and I also have a lot more experience controlling those. So what I'll do is maybe change the light radius, change the number of rays, and change the ray depth. So ray depth is important for like reflective surfaces and transparent surfaces, so that you can actually see the shadow within the surface. So the ray depth is like how many times you get to see the shadow reflect if you put 2 mirrors next to each other. So 2 minimum. And then the number of rays is the accuracy. So 8 to 16 to 32 to 64 and so on. So when I render this now, I should see a reasonably sharper shadow. See? It's not too bad. So I'm getting something that's a little bit more like what I saw in real time. And there's many other things I can do to help change the shadow quality, and I intended to play with those things. One of the things right off the top is going to be the shadow color. So I can actually increase that to a lighter gray color, and quite literally when you increase that color, you're in effect affecting the intensity of it, I suppose, is one way of saying it. So, or the transparency of it. So you can see here it working out pretty good. So I don't have any bounce lights, I don't have any rim lights. I'm not using any fancy lighting effects like global illumination or the skylight shader or image-based lighting or final gathering. There are all these other options that I have for lighting, and it's worth a huge discussion. But that's not what I'm going to do here. I'm just going to give you some tips on what it is you need to do to get these models to look decent. If you really want to dig into this, I highly recommend the book by Jeremy Byrne, Digital Lighting and Rendering. And he also has a DVD called Digital Lighting and Rendering DVD set that specifically trains you on how to do lighting in Maya. So it's well worth looking into. So there's my little plug for Jeremy Byrne. I hope he appreciates that. Okay, so I'm going to spend some time figuring out exactly where I want my shadows, and I'm going to use depth map shadows to help me preview and see that. And one of the really cool things about Viewport 2.0 is just take a look at how accurate that shadow is at that really high resolution of 4000. And I can just pull this back and just watch those shadows in the background as I animate this light back and forth. Of course, this is very dramatic kind of headlight, spotlight shadow. I'm not that interested in that, but it is pretty cool to see that in real time. I am more interested in this top-down, sunlit panel, kind of a sunroof, sunlight angle, and I'm looking forward to having some of the shadow, some of the lines from the stairwell casting onto the items on the turntable. I thought that would be a very attractive, and I'm going to spend some time softening those shadows so that they don't obstruct the view too drastically. I've been spending some time with the layout of the objects before I get back to any lighting, and I decided I want to put the Monopoly house on the stairwell steps and really bring down the scale on it so it's more to real world scale on these. I think it's cute, and I'd like to have a lot of them. So I don't have any fancy tricks for you, no particle emitters or anything fancy like that, or any kind of rigid body dynamics for you, at least not in this trainee. But what I am going to do is make several duplicates of this, instances of it, and I want to then use a script to randomly rotate them on the y-axis so that they're not all pointing in the same direction. I don't have to go through and manually do them all. So let's make like maybe 10 of them and run that. Distribute those around. I'll then take the random rotation and run that. So let's just take these few that I have moved. And here's the random rotation between 0 and 360 degrees. And I'll just play that until you get something interesting. So you just snap one each to the step and randomize the rotation, and it looks pretty good. These little tiny details here in the corner. So the grapes may be severed from their original curves, but they're still not completely impossible to place and control. I can still control them with deformers. So what I'm going to do is convert all of this stuff to one object, and I want to put a bend deformer on it so that I can control a little bit sort of how it arcs and lays on objects just a bit. I could throw the bend deformer on it right now, but it would bend each item individually, and the grape, based on the way I built it, is still all individual pieces. So I'm going to convert the NURBS that are in here. I'm going to combine them, all those meshes together into one mesh, and then I'm going to throw a bend deformer on it. Once I'm done with the conversion and the combining, I'll get back to the recording. Okay, so I'm done with the conversion and I've combined them together. So I've got one solid object for the grapes, and I've brought in a locator, and I'm going to make the locator the parent of that mesh so that it becomes just a little bit easier for me to position and snap this. So all I have to do is grab that locator, and I'm going to be at the base of the object. Next, what I'm going to do is apply the deformer. So let's do that. Let's put this at the origin. It makes it a little bit easier to deal with. And let's actually just pull it on the z-axis. That should be fine. Just pull it right here. And then I want to come over to the animation and create deformer, nonlinear, and I want the bend. And it'll take a moment to apply it. Basically, take a close look at bend here. It's at first it's vertical, and you want to see the effect of it. Just animate the curvature so you can see more or less what it's going to do. So right now it's bending from the center. So what I want to do is give it a little bit of curvature so I can see what's happening here. And I want to rotate the entire bend object because it is indeed it's a brand new node. It's a brand new object. So it has its own transformation node. So what I'm going to do is center this to 0. So it basically matches the same location as the locator. And also on the y-axis, its z-axis is could be anything. I'll just adjust it so it centers it with the branch. And then I want to rotate it on the z-axis 90 degrees. And right there you start to see the effect of the bend. Isn't that cool? So now I can do things like, change its rotation, and that will change the direction of the bend. So at 90-degree rotation, what I can do is change the curvature to go one way or the other. It's pretty awesome, actually. So it does shear some of the grapes, but it's so because of the stylized modeling of the grapes, I think it's negligible. So it's got this low bound and high bound parameter where you can basically change like how far forward does it push, how far forward does it bend, and same thing on the other end. So if you don't want any bending on the other end, you just put this all the way to 0, and now it's all low bound. And then the amount of curvature. So now I have the ability to get this in place, grab the locator, and move it into place. And I can also move. See, I actually, for an animation effect, I can move the grapes through the bend. So that would be an interesting effect right there. Not quite what I'm looking for though. What I want to know, and I don't know this yet, but what I want to know is if I can make the bend operator, the bend handle a child of this as well without hurting it. And it looks good. So very, very, very cool. So we'll make the bend handle a child of the locator as well. And this is my new bent grapes. And I'm going to move these into place. So I was thinking about putting them in this this ribbed cup, the plastic cup. or maybe drape it over top of something, maybe one of the other mugs. I'll be back when I'm done with that. This is actually quite cool. So I was able to, with the locator, I moved it into the cup and, positioned it and translated it based on object space. And then I just clipped it so that it was just barely clipping on the inside. So something like that, I guess. And then I just started to adjust the bend angle, the bend curvature, until it started clipping out here. So it's pretty cool. A decent amount of control. And things are obscured a bit by the stairwell and the cup, and so I'm able to hide it just a little bit there. So that works out too. What's also pretty cool is that because I never actually merged any points with the grapes, each of the grapes are their own polygon islands. So even though it's a combined mesh, I can go to face mode and just double click it and get this individual grape right here. So what does that mean? Well, that means that I can go through double clicking objects that I want to manipulate and get the stems and the grapes like that. And then if I want to rotate it, I can just hit the rotate, hold down D, move the rotation handle to where I want to rotate it, and then just pivot at that point. So pretty cool, actually. It's just one more advantage of having all those parts and pieces in a nice hierarchy.